All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of your favorite podcast and show, Assent, Dissent. Tonight, I am without my co-host, Brandon, as I do this solo interview. But I am happy to welcome Joshua Lanzinger, the Honorable Joshua Lanzinger. He is a judge for the Toledo Municipal Court, serving in his second term. He previously was a solo practitioner and also worked for the Ohio Attorney General. And as well, he comes from a family of legal minds. His mother, Judith Ann Lanzinger, was the only woman elected to all four levels of the Ohio judiciary. And she also retired as an associate justice from the Ohio Supreme Court. So we're excited to welcome him. We know that he has a great deal of expertise as we talk tonight about the color of justice. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So want to talk to you tonight. Our topic is the color of justice. We know that there are major disparities when it comes to not only the prison population, but also the arrest, the sentencing, and just the way minorities in general appear to be treated in the American judicial system. So as a member of the bench and also a former practicing attorney and a person that comes from a legal family, just want to get your ideas and your opinions on a few things and maybe help shed some light for our viewers as to how things are working the way they work and what are some steps or approaches we can take to not only, work for de-incarceration, but to also make sure that justice is fair across the board for all Americans. I was reading, and according to the Prison Policy Initiative, their 2016 study found that nearly 2.3 million Americans are incarcerated. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, 34% of the male prison population was Black males, and 24% were Hispanic males. According to Pew Research, though, Blacks are only 12% of the U.S. population, whereas Hispanics are only 16% of the U.S. population. And they were telling us that Blacks are 6 times the imprisonment rate of whites. For people who see these facts and these statistics in the prison population in America, can you speak to how that even came to be, how minorities represent more than whites in the prison system in America? How do we even get here?
Well, I mean, as I'm sure you know, books have been made on this topic alone. So for me to point to one thing and say that's the reason, in the short time that we have today, wouldn't really do the issue justice. But if I had to whittle down everything and get to the core source of it, I think a lot of it has to do with poverty. I mean, most people committing crimes aren't committing crimes just because they're bored, they don't have anything to do. They're doing it for a particular purpose. And I think when people come from poverty, that kind of drives their decisions, and that's kind of really across the board with regard to all types of crimes. Even you talk the minor crimes, the misdemeanors, as well as up to the felonies. But a lot of it, I think, is poverty driven. So
then in your estimation, if it's poverty driven, I guess a good solution for that to help people out, basically, we would probably need more social opportunities for those that are in impoverished communities, or and I hate the stigma that's associated with welfare, but for lack of better terms, more social welfare programs or just those types of opportunities.
Yeah, well, and you're talking about welfare or public assistance. I don't even know when I say poverty, I don't necessarily mean strictly from a financial monetary standpoint, but just overall. So, let me give an example.
Okay.
Because I don't see like the major crimes in my court. I see, the misdemeanors in the city court. So I can just really speak for what I see in my court. So a good example would be some of the crimes that we see. One of the things that I see a lot in my court would be like driving without a valid license. That's very, very common.
Mm-hmm.
And that primarily becomes because people can't afford their license, because with comes the license, comes the registration, comes the cost of gas, comes the cost of insurance, comes the cost of maintenance and upkeep. And someone's got a job, they need to get the job, they got to drive. Okay. But if they're making minimum wage, if they've got a choice to make between pay for their insurance or put food on the table, that's a no-brainer decision. Or if they got, pay $80 for their registration for the year, or, get books for their kids, for school, that's, so that type of thing is really low on the list of priorities when you're talking about food, shelter, clothing, electricity, gas, phone bill, and all the other expenses that people have. Okay. So again, we'll see a lot of people that don't have a valid license because simply they can't afford it. A lot of things we'll also see too, just with substance abuse issues. Typically we'll see a lot more substance abuse issues coming from people from poorer communities, and that's just a plain fact. Oftentimes that will cover a whole host of different issues. They got substance abuse issues, they need to feed that substance abuse issue. So what do they do to feed that substance abuse issue? They'll steal. They'll go on the, steal money or steal whatever it is so that you can further that that substance abuse issue. So again, if you whittle all that down, again, it's a matter of poverty. So.
Got you. So you see then in your court, and I guess it's important to explain to our viewers, then the things that you see in your court are mainly smaller offenses and not major offenses that will probably be in state courts.
Right. So the Toledo Municipal Court, our jurisdiction solely with misdemeanors. Misdemeanors in Ohio is punishable up to 6 months in jail and up to $1,000 fine. Anything higher than that goes to what some people call the big court, which is across the street, the common pleas court.
Okay, so then real quickly, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, as well as my own, can you give us a quick, small little, in layman's terms, breakdown of the different courts? And you just told us basically you deal with a lot of misdemeanors. And so it sounds like the most that you can ever sentence anyone to is 6 months in jail or a fine of $1,000. Anything beyond that is not your jurisdiction, correct?
Correct.
All
So all misdemeanors, all felonies will go over to Court of Common Pleas. That's a county court, all of Lucas County.
Okay.
And they handle the felonies. That's the robberies, the rapes, the murders, those serious crimes. And of course, the penalties for that can go up to whatever.
Okay. Those are the kind of things that you need a jury for, right?
Well, no. Anytime you have potential to be incarcerated as a punishment for the crime, you have a right to a jury. So even in my court, even a simple crime, disorderly conduct while intoxicated, is a misdemeanor of the 4th degree. It's only punishable up to 30 days, but since it's punishable with incarceration, you have a right to a jury.
Interesting. I never knew that. So, okay. So then for the help of our listeners and viewers who are not super familiar with the legal system, 9 times out of 10, though, those of us that get those jury summons in the mail, I know a lot of people don't necessarily like being summoned. I myself really wish that I could get summoned on a high profile case, because I think that will be cool. But 9 times out of 10, those of us that get jury summons, are those most likely going to be for the Court of Common Pleas or higher? Or is it sometimes also for your court?
Well, it's both.
Okay.
So when you get a summons, you'll get summons to go to common pleas court, and depending on the needs of our court, they'll send some of that pool over to us.
Okay.
But most of the time, in my court, it's a bench trial. It's tried to the judge, and only in very rare circumstances is there a full jury trial.
Okay, so after Court of Common Pleas, then what's next? Is that your district court of appeals?
Yes, but once you get to the Court of Appeals, it's no longer what's called a trial court. So only in Ohio, the municipal court and Court of Common Pleas actually hear cases.
Got you.
Once you go to the Court of Appeals, they just review the lower courts, my court and the Court of Common Pleas, and they just review the cases just to make sure that we did everything all right. So
that's what's called an appellate court. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a district, 6th district court here.
Mm-hmm.
The seat happens to be in Lucas County, but it covers 8 counties in all of Northwest Ohio.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And then above that, of course, is the Ohio Supreme Court.
Oh, interesting. So like if somebody doesn't like a ruling that you made, then they would appeal to the 6th District Court of Appeals?
Correct.
Got you. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for helping us understand a little better. So now my questions will be a little more fine-tuned. Okay. So it seems like in the prison population, though, which is something that, so according to the research that I've done in Ohio, or at least where we're talking, then most of the people that will have made judgment decisions to add to the prison population would have been on the common pleas side of things, because from what I understand, most of the research that is done are for people that are sentenced for at least a year or more.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are statistics for, my court, and we don't send people to prison. We send people out from my court to CCNO.
Oh, got you. Okay.
Out in Stryker. Mm-hmm.
Got you. Interesting. Okay. Well, so according to the Sentencing Project, in Ohio, minorities, specifically Black men, account for 1 in 22 of the prison population, which is just a little higher than the state average, which is 1 in 26. And what I found is that from the initial point of arrest to the final point of sentencing, there is a multitude of disparities there, racially. I guess even though you're at the final point, which comes to sentencing, what are some of, in your opinion, maybe the hurdles or the disparities that minorities may have to face? And what are some ways that we can take to overcome those things, like overcome those barriers?
Wow. Again, another topic that people have written books about.
Lots of book topics here.
Yeah. I mean, that is a tough question. I mean, if you're talking about the disparity, I mean, you have to look at under what circumstances people are getting arrested and for what. Mm-hmm. So, and again, in my court, I don't see people that are getting sentenced to prison. That's people that are committing the robberies and the grand thefts and that sort of thing. And so I only can speak from my court, but but I mean, from looking at it from why is the Black population overrepresented, I guess you should say, for lack of a better term, in our prison population and our jail population. Again, I think it comes back down to poverty. And I say it in a very simplistic way, but I mean it really in a very broad term. Mm-hmm. as far as poverty, because again, the people that you see typically in the prisons aren't coming from well-to-do backgrounds, right? We
Right.
see people, the people that go into these great high schools and great colleges and have a great future aren't the ones that we're typically seeing in the prisons. It's the people that coming from the lower income neighborhoods. So they've got much, much harder struggles, because they're starting off pretty much behind the curve as it starts. One of the things that we need to start looking at is giving, us minorities, putting us in a better position to succeed, from an early start, and I think that really would go a long way. Give them options, give people that are coming from these poor neighborhoods, from these poor backgrounds, give them options, so that they don't have to go this route. They can go this route because they've got these opportunities given to them. So I think that's what's really, really lacking currently.
All right. Now, for clarification, because we have a number of people that don't just watch this show live, but we also have a number of people that listen to this via their podcast, wherever podcasts are available. You said something, and I always try to clarify this, especially when we're talking on topics of race or even on sex. It's obvious that Judge Lanzinger, for those of you listening, is a male. But earlier he said, us minorities. So can you give us a little bit of your Black background for those that are listening and not watching, so that they can't see you, of how you identify?
Yes. In fact, sometimes people get a little confused when they look up my mother on Google and see that she's blonde hair and blue eyed, but I was adopted. So, I am a Black man that, was adopted by a white family. So.
Okay, awesome. I don't think a lot of people hardly know that. I'll even say that always comes up a lot of times as you're running. But for a little bit of background for our viewers and listeners, Judge Lanzinger, if I'm not mistaken, is the only person of color seated on the Muni bench. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm the only Black judge in the Toledo Municipal Court. And interestingly, I'm only the 5th out of the 100-year history of the Toledo Municipal Court. Wow. I'm only the 5th Black judge.
I didn't know that. Do you think perhaps that also, especially when it comes to the final point of sentencing, do you think that could also be a major factor on all levels of the judiciary, why minorities experience such stiffer sentences? Not necessarily because there's not another minority looking them at the bench trying to give them a break because, they're of the same ethnicity, but for the simple fact that there isn't a minority on the bench who has the knowledge or the understanding, where you could, of the struggles facing that community, and you could probably understand their offense to a different degree.
Yeah, it's and what we would call that is like implicit bias. Now, all not just judges, but all people like to think that, I'm not biased against anybody. I'm fair and neutral and I treat everybody equally. But studies show that that's not true for anybody. I mean, we all have, again, what's called implicit biases. In fact, our court, we go through implicit bias training because we want to try to curtail that as much as possible. So certainly there would be, you would think that there would be some implicit bias with some judges sentencing people that they really don't know a whole lot about.
One of the things that I was reading, according to, I think it was called the Sentencing Project, was a lot of respondents, regardless of race, were more used to identifying those of a minority descent, especially African American, with words like dangerous, threat to society, menace, basically just thinking that not locking them up, it will be more harmful to society to have them out on the street. So that implicit bias, it sounds like, as you said, is all around the board. And I mean, of course, not asking if you have any implicit bias, but just being on the bench, having colleagues, could you say that it is very fair that members of the judiciary do have implicit bias and that can weigh in when they are making a sentence?
Well, absolutely. And I will, you said, I'm sure that you don't have implicit. I do. Everybody has implicit bias. The question is whether or not you're going to recognize that and do what you can to curtail that as much as possible. So again, like I said, in our court, we actually go through implicit bias training to try to recognize those instances where implicit bias may rear its ugly head and what to do to avoid it.
So are you allowed to share with us just briefly like what that training looks like and how they prepare you all to recognize it and steer clear of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a day-long training that everybody in our court goes through. And again, recognizing it really is the big hurdle, because again, most people like to think that, I treat everybody equally. I'm fair and unbiased, and but just recognizing it is really the biggest step in the whole process of trying to address implicit bias.
All right. In your court, do you see any drug-related offenses or drug-related charges?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Right. Now, once someone is in possession of a certain amount of drugs, and it's different for each type of a drug, then it becomes a felony, and then of course that's where it gets kicked over to across the street. But certainly, drug paraphernalia and drug possession to a lesser amount, yeah, I'll definitely see that in my court.
Now, question for you: why is the law written on amount per drug? Like, where does that factoring or that idea come in? I'm assuming that's probably going to deal more with our legislators and policymakers, but I would think if we're talking about, illegal substances, the possession should be along the same, or the amount of possession rather should be along the same, regardless if it's marijuana, cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, any of those things that are illegal. Wouldn't it just be more fair if we say possession of this amount of any illegal substance is punishable on this degree?
Well, that's more of a question for a legislator than for a judge, but I would assume the answer would be something to the effect of, marijuana is much less dangerous than fentanyl. Mm-hmm. Also, marijuana weighs lighter than cocaine. So
I don't have a history of drugs, so I don't know what to think.
Well, that's good. That's good. And yeah, so I would assume that's the reason why they vary the different weights and then the types of drugs as well. And the reason why eventually it become a felony is because eventually it's assumed that you're not just using it, you're dealing it, because if someone gets caught with a small bag of marijuana or whatever, that's one thing. If they get caught with a trunk load of it,
then you're probably assumed to be dealing,
right?
Which is also illegal,
right?
Okay. Again, doing some research from the Sentencing Project, one thing that I found interesting, which I guess I kind of knew in the back of my mind but really didn't know, was that use for illegal drugs is almost the same regardless of race or gender. Like, it's almost used at the same. But even in light of that, Blacks are 4 times as likely as whites to be arrested, and they're 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possession. And then they were saying from the years of 95 to 2005, 13% of drug users were African American, but 36% made up the arrest and 46% made up the conviction rates. Why is it then do we think, or in your opinion, that Black people or any minority is more likely to be arrested and convicted of possession than a white person?
That's a very good question. And I'm certainly not an expert on, or nor am I a police officer to say,
True.
why I would be more inclined to arrest this person over that person. I would assume that would have to do something with where police are patrolling and where police decide to focus their efforts, and where police decide to this person looks suspicious, so this is the person that I'm going to try to tail.
Do you, in your court, would you say that you have seen the disparities that are given way of in this research?
Disparities between
so like, could you say in the affirmative, I do see more minorities pass through my court on, accounts of drug possession than I do see non-minorities or whites?
Just anecdotally, I don't see a big discrepancy between Blacks and whites. You're talking about for like drug possession type charges?
Well, so like, if you had to go back and say like, okay, pre-COVID, when we probably actually saw people in court, but like a month pre-COVID, okay, yeah, maybe I saw, and I'm just throwing random numbers out, I probably did see 85 minorities come in on possession, whereas I probably only saw 10 whites this month come in on possession. Like that kind of disparity. Do you see that in your court?
Not no, not to the extent that it's like, wow, there's a big, huge difference between, I'm seeing, 30 minorities and one white person. It's not, I don't see it that big of a disparity in our court. But again, you have to be looking at where the police are focusing their efforts. Their police are patrolling heavily and doing a lot of arrests and in areas, such as North Toledo and the East Side, and where a lot of minority neighborhoods. I mean, you don't see as strong police presence in the outlining areas of the city, where there's less minorities living. I live kind of on the border of Sylvania Township, kind of snuggled between Sylvania Township and Ottawa Hills. And actually, in my neighborhood, there's a fair amount of minorities, but it's certainly not 50-50,
Right.
But, the areas that tend to have a higher population of minorities. And again, this is going back, to our poverty discussion. That's the areas that are getting patrolled heavily by police. And that's probably what counts for why a lot of minorities are getting picked up.
So in your estimation, I know the decriminalization, there we go, of marijuana is like a huge topic across the nation and across states. Of course, certain states have, legalized cannabis recreationally and medically. Our neighbors up the road in Michigan have it. If we take that approach in Ohio, do you think it would be fair to commute the sentences of those who are facing, large sentences for either possession or usage that are already in prison? How would that work judicially? Like, is that even an option? Because I know a lot of people talk about, well, if we're going to decriminalize marijuana and we're going to make it legal, then we need to go commute the sentences of offenders and expunge their records and give them restitution. How does that look judicially and in regards to the law? Is it possible? And if it is possible, how would that even work?
Okay, well, first off, small amount of marijuana possession is a minor misdemeanor. It's punishable with a fine.
Okay.
So really, even as it currently stands in Toledo, I mean, you got to have a certain amount of marijuana for actually to be elevated to more than just just a minor crime. So I don't see a whole lot of people getting picked up for simply marijuana possession. Mm-hmm. Now, when I first became a judge, I was in courtroom 3, and that's where we do felony preliminary hearings. Mm-hmm. We don't actually handle the felony case, but we kind of act as like a staging ground to see whether or not it's going to go to the big court, common pleas court. And in that case, there was a person that had 33 bags of marijuana on them. And that bumped it up to a felony.
Yeah, I'm going to say that's a lot of bags.
Yeah. But recreational use of marijuana is again, if you have a small amount of it, it's a minor misdemeanor. It's punishable with a fine. And we don't see a whole lot of people getting picked up just for, a small amount of marijuana. That being said, if it suddenly becomes legal in Toledo or in Ohio, I really don't know how you would, whether you'd have to look at, past sentences for people that did have those 33 bags of marijuana, whether or not we got to commute those sentences or look back that. Again, that's the role for the legislature, something that, I wouldn't be involved in.
So when it comes to commuting a sentence, then judges are not involved in that process at all?
No, that would be a statutory provision to determine whether or not, whether it would work retroactively or not. But it's not a matter of a judge determining whether or not they're going to commute a sentence with the change of the law. Mm-hmm.
I think what's really interesting here, and I think probably one of the approaches that I take to major problems like this, and probably one of the reasons a lot of people supported my candidacy when I was a candidate, was because I feel like a lot of times when people make these laws or have these ideas, not to say that they're not bad ideas, they don't consult all of the parties that are involved. Like, for instance, if we're going to decriminalize the use of marijuana, I definitely think that there should be some commuting of sentences. But before I did that, it just sounds like common sense that I would probably consult someone from the legal community to say, hey, how would this actually work? What are your thoughts on this? Or what's the best way of going and doing that? I mean, isn't that a fair thing to say, like, hey, it's common sense, maybe you should ask someone from the legal community their thoughts on this and, how this would work?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes legislatures, when they make laws, they do it only as a knee-jerk reaction to a problem, and their solution doesn't account for the second and third effects of what they're doing. So yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head that you definitely need to look at all the angles and consult people that would be knowledgeable of what those second and third effects would be.
So in this case, for decriminalizing marijuana, what do you see in your position as what some of those second and third effects are if we're talking about commuting sentences or giving restitution or something like that?
Oh, first we need to know, how many people are currently incarcerated for marijuana possession. We'd also have to take a look at, if you're talking about restitution, I'm not sure what that would look like as far as, are we paying a per diem, or what exactly are you talking
Well,
about?
I guess so. These are just things that I've heard in the wind from different blogs and different public opinion of, oh, this is what you should do for those who are currently locked up. You've taken so many years off of their life where they weren't able to get jobs and be productive members of society, blah, 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 blah. So we should give them some money. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing because I don't know. I haven't studied this in depth. But what would that look? What would that look like? How is that even plausible?
Yeah, well, again, I'm a judge, not a lawmaker, and I'd leave that decision to the lawmakers to determine what it would look like if they decide to make marijuana legal.
Okay. Another question for you. Something interesting that I found in researching with the sentencing project is pretrial detention is a huge thing that I guess, minorities are more often likely to experience this because of a lack of, and this goes, to what you were saying, poverty, but in this case, a lack of resources and finances. But those who, suffer from pretrial detention are more likely to not only be convicted of their charges, but also more likely to be sentenced to longer terms. Can you briefly explain for our listeners and our viewers what pretrial detention is and how that works, or what a judge would use as a determining factor to levy that?
Okay, well, pretrial detention is just what it sounds like. It's someone being incarcerated before their trial. There's a number of factors that go into whether or not a person is going to be incarcerated prior to the trial, but the main two purposes is whether or not they're going to commit more crimes if they're released, and two, whether or not they actually will show up to court for their trial.
Oh, right. So pretrial is really used then to also probably, especially in regards to your court, make sure they actually show up for their trial.
Absolutely. So in Lucas County, we have really done a great job as far as pretrial incarceration. I'd like to say, very well ahead of the curve as far as what we've done in criminal justice reform. Back in 2015, we implemented what's called a public safety assessment. So each person that gets booked into Lucas County Jail, now they're interviewed, and there's a number of factors that go into their interview, such as what their prior record looks like, the type of offense that they're being charged with, if they have a prior record, whether or not they've showed up to court or not. So all these factors are taken into consideration to determine a recommendation of whether or not the person should be released, what's called on their own recognizance, meaning that we're going to trust you that you're going to not commit more crimes and you're going to show up on your trial date, or whether or not they should be incarcerated and have a cash bond set for their case. We've significantly reduced our jail population. I think the last statistics I've seen was about 15% over the last few years. So that's done really a whole lot, to help our jail population for pretrial. In fact, in our court, we also have a local rule that certain crimes, you'll automatically get released and be given a court date. So you'll get booked into the jail, but then you'll just get automatically released, and they'll give you and say, show up, on this day, for your arraignment. So.
Okay. Next question that I looked up, or next thing that I looked up on the sentencing project, habitual offender laws. I didn't realize how almost potentially dangerous these are kind of for minorities, because it was saying, and it gave like a ton of research, that basically minorities are more often tried under habitual offender laws than their white counterparts. And these habitual offender laws are really the things that kind of, I guess, would stick to them more and, weigh in on why they're sentenced, to a lot more jail time than their white counterparts. In your estimation, is habitual offender laws really a good thing, and when they should not be applied?
Well, habitual offender law is nothing that I deal with in my court. And like in Ohio, we don't have like a 3 strikes type of habitual offender law as well. What we do have is like penalties can potentially go up with a repeat offense. For example, like an OVI, driving while intoxicated. Your first offense carries a certain penalty, but after your second offense carries a higher penalty, and your third offense also carries a higher penalty even so. So that's really what I would only see, in my court. Whether or not they're effective, I don't know. And whenever you talk to a judge about mandatory sentencing, we cringe, because there's always an exception that the legislature probably don't realize. And really, every person is different. Every crime is different. Every situation is different. So, personally, I'm not a fan of, either habitual offender type laws or anything that takes the discretion out of the judge's hands, because that could certainly lead to unjust results.
So habitual offender laws, then it almost sounds like, in anything with mandatory sentencing, almost sounds like not only does it take the discretion out of your hand, but you don't have the ability to decide on a case-by-case basis,
right?
Which it sounds like is the more effective way.
Right. So, you really you'll need to hold a better way to do it is hold the judges accountable. If you don't like the way a judge is ruling or the way the judge is, handling his court, then you need to vote him out. But for the legislature to take that discretion out of the judge's hand and say, we don't trust you to do the right thing, we're going to make you sentence this way for this type of offense, or if they do this offense again, then you have to sentence this way. And again, the more discretion you take out of a judge's hands, more likely, or the more possibility for there to be an unjust result.
Interesting. So, a question for you then. When it comes to ruling on a case then in your court, what type of factors do you consider or do you weigh in when you're imposing a sentence?
Well, my goal whenever I'm sentencing somebody is that I'll never want to see this person again. So whatever offense they've committed, driving without a valid license, drinking and driving, drug possession.
Now, real quick, let's clarify. You never want to see them again because you want them to be locked away for the rest of their life, or you want them to turn around and make good decisions?
Well, the latter, yes. Thank you for clarifying that. No, I certainly, the absolute last thing I want to do is put somebody in jail. That's the absolute, I don't want to do that. There's so many bad effects for incarceration. a lot of the people that we see, as I had mentioned, have substance abuse issues. A lot of the people that we see have mental health issues. People have jobs. People have families. I don't want to take that away from people. That's the absolute last thing I want to do. So again, for when I sentence somebody, I want to fashion a sentence that will put the person in the best position so that I don't have to see them in my court again because they're not committing another crime. They've addressed whatever issues they've got going on in their life.
Got you. All right, so let's talk real quick about the driving without a valid driver's license. That's a big issue that I personally know about only because I've working in City Hall. I see the first Wednesdays, I think it is, where people are trying to get
Reentry program.
Yeah, trying to get their license back and things like that. What can someone do? I guess this would be a legislative question, but what would your suggestions be? Because driving without a valid driver's license, as you said, there are a number of factors that go into that, especially having car insurance. Because in Ohio, at least, the law is if you don't have car insurance, then you can't be driving and you should have your license suspended. But we know car insurance is especially expensive. And depending on who you are, what kind of car you drive, where you live, all of those factor in how expensive your premium is going to be. So if somebody can't afford car insurance, but they need to get back and forth to work to put food on the table and a roof over their head and provide for their children or whatever their family situation is, it almost seems like an unfair imposition, or there's something that we need to do to make car insurance more affordable for people.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. That's more of a, legislative issue than something that the courts can address. But yeah, I mean, people need to drive. They always say that driving is a privilege, not a right. But in today's society, you need to get around. You do. But if I could kind of add on to that, it's kind of going a little bit off of what you mentioned about just the cost of driving. I want to just make sure that people know that if you don't have a valid license, you have options out there. Okay. A lot of times people, they've got fines from the courts. They've got oftentimes child support in arrears. Whatever the case may be, they've got reinstatement fees from the BMV. There's nothing that's not insurmountable. I mean, you can always get valid if you put in a little effort. For our court, for example, if you owe fines and costs, currently we accept 25% of what you owe us, and when you pay 25%, and then we'll give you additional time, pay the remainder. For child support, the child support court, they'll allow a payment plan. For reinstatement fees for the BMV, they have a payment plan. So you've got options out there. So I just want to make sure that people understand, because this is a very common thing that I see in my court, that people just feel so overwhelmed that they're like, forget it, I can never get valid. I'm just gonna, keep on driving without a valid license. And I tell people,
case or what you want them to do.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I understand that people need to drive, but also I'm a judge, and the law is the law is the law. So I can't change the law. It's my job, and people, elected me to enforce the law and make sure the law is upheld. But it's people have options out there if they want to get valid. And you had mentioned, for the reentry program, typically the reentry program is more for people getting out of prison, that first Wednesday program.
Right.
But I mean, that's a good opportunity for people to go there, and they have that, every Wednesday. With the pandemic going on, I'm not sure what they're doing now, but outside of the pandemic, it's usually held every Wednesday at the government center there, and people are there to assist people with different things, and one of the things is to get valid, and they'll tell people exactly what they need to do and how to get valid.
All right. I think too, and I'm wondering if maybe my thought assessment for this is correct. Is it possible when it comes to, in our case, the big court of common pleas, is it possible that the reason people can be sentenced to higher sentences is because by the time they get there, they have a number of these misdemeanors against them?
Are you saying that's why they're able to get sentenced that high, or
that could be a factor in the judge sentencing them so high? Is because by the time they get to common pleas, they've probably had quite a few misdemeanors already.
Well, that's a sentencing factor, not necessarily a reason why what the law is for that particular punishment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have higher sentences for more serious crimes. Obviously, if you steal $50 from a $50 item from Walmart, that's not as serious as if you go with a handgun and rob a bank. So
absolutely,
robbing the bank's going to be a higher penalty, and it really has nothing to do with someone's prior history. So what you're talking about more is like a sentencing consideration for a judge. And yeah, certainly that's something that we judges take in consideration, not just in my court, but in common pleas court too, with their prior history. Certainly I'll give a stiffer sentence for somebody that, has committed a multitude of prior similar offenses. If somebody's, got convicted in my court for theft, and I see in the record, oh, okay, you've got, a dozen prior theft charges, I'll sentence that person, harsher than somebody for first offense or second offense.
Gotcha. All right. The right to vote is taken away at what point?
Well, typically it's every state's different, and it's typically for people who are convicted of felonies and they're incarcerated. Most states, once they're released from prison, they'll get their right to vote back, with the exception of, I think, about 3 states. But
what do you have to do to get your right to vote back?
It depends on the state. Again, every state's different for that.
Okay.
Some states, most states actually, you don't have to do anything. Once you get released from prison, you can vote. Other states, other states, you have other requirements. And again, I think there's very few, like 2 or 3 states where if you're convicted of felony, you've just permanently forfeited your right to vote.
So in Ohio, is there something that an offender would need to do once released?
I do not believe so. I believe in Ohio, once they're released from prison, then they can vote. Don't quote me on that, but that's what I think the law is in Ohio. Yeah.
Okay. Do you personally, and I don't know if this is something you can actually answer because you're sitting on the bench or not, but personally, do you believe it's fair that someone who is serving time, that they are stripped from their right to vote while they're incarcerated?
Yeah.
And the reason I ask is because me personally, I don't think that it's fair that someone incarcerated does not have the right to vote because A, they're still a citizen. And I guess I would say I might even wage that on probably the situation of why they're incarcerated. Like, I mean, someone who's incarcerated for murder, maybe I might be okay with them not having the right to vote versus someone who's incarcerated for something much lesser. But the reason why I think overall it's not fair is because, especially speaking in Ohio, when you look at the way population is determined for representation, prison population is counted toward representation. So how can you count these people for representation, but then not give them the ability to have a voice in said representation? And then also, it could very well be that the policies certain legislatures have made are the reason for them having such a stiffer sentence, or forfeiting that right to vote because they are incarcerated, not necessarily just because they did something wrong, but because of habitual offender laws or mandatory sentencing laws or things like that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this is a topic that I really can't comment on. I mean, being a judge, I mean, that might be something if I one day come to the Ohio Supreme Court, I might actually see something like this in front of me. So I have to avoid those types of issues.
Okay.
That being said, I don't see any flaw in your logic.
Okay. All right. So first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with us. I know that we're past time. So thank you so much for being with us. Of course, I would love to have you back on the show when we bring in other legal minds and just talk about other different things. What does the future have for you? Where do you see yourself in the judicial community? Are you ever going to seek to be on the Ohio Supreme Court or anything above then?
We'll see. I'm still relatively, young and early in my career. So I don't know. We'll see. I mean, right now I'm just focused on being the best municipal court judge that I can be. And, I'll try to, kind of work on the things that I'm focused on currently in my court, and we'll just kind of have to wait and see from there. But I don't have any grand plan or grand scheme. I don't try to look too far ahead. I just want to really concentrate on what's in front of me.
Okay. Do you have any, and I don't know if you can speak on this or not sitting on the bench, but are there any ideas for reform that you have that you want to work on, or would influence other people to work on, as far as the criminal justice system, not just in Toledo or Lucas County or Ohio, but even the nation?
Sure. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, a lot of the things that I was previously working on has kind of come to a halt because it's difficult to have meetings and that sort of thing. One of the things that I'm fairly passionate about is addressing mental health issues in our community, because we do see a lot of people in our court that really don't belong in jail. They've got mental health issues that if that was addressed, that would really help our criminal justice system. I think sometimes that police pick up people with mental health issues and they put them through the system because they don't really know what else to do with them. And we're addressing that. So that's something that I'm passionate about and something that I'll be working on in the future.
Okay, great. If any of our listeners or viewers would like to contact you and ask you any legal questions or anything of that nature, do you have contact information for them that you could share?
Sure. With the caveat that, as a judge, I can't offer legal advice, but if they've got questions about, the process or the court, or my judicial philosophy or that sort of thing, certainly I can field those types of questions. But really, I don't have a website now, but I do have a Facebook page under just Judge Lanzinger, Judge Josh Lanzinger. You can type that in and you can find me there, and you can send me a message, and yeah, I'll certainly answer it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being with us, talking with us tonight about the judicial process. We appreciate all of the expertise that you gave to us and all of your views. And like I said, we definitely look forward to having you again.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, you guys, that's it for tonight's segment, The Color of Justice with the Honorable Judge Josh Lanzinger of the Toledo Municipal Court. Again, I'm Shaun Strong for Assent, Dissent. You can like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And we are available wherever you find your podcast. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.